Hello and welcome. I'm Kyle Markwalter for Film Bite. And today, for Film Bite Dishes, I'm bringing you a little look at exploitation films. So, exploitation films. What's an exploitation film? An exploitation film is a film that tries to succeed financially by exploiting some sort of either current trend, niche genre, or lurid subject matter. Usually this means that it has a lot of sex, violence, nudity, or cheap romance in it because those things are easy to do on the cheap and often attract a lot of attention from viewers. Now, exploitation films are kind of the uncool thing to study in cinema and media studies. Oftentimes their focus is on the high quality or super popular films like the things we talk about in film classes, Citizen Kane, Taxi Driver, big budget things like Star Wars, Jaws, the kinds of stuff that you hear a lot about. Oftentimes we don't talk about exploitation films because they're the kind of seedy underbelly of the film world. They're often not quite pornography, but they're not quite appropriate subject matter either, and so we often don't talk about them. But exploitation films have been really influential in terms of the grand scheme of film history. So let's talk about them for a little while. Movies that have tried to exploit lurid, cheap subject matter have been around for a long time. At least since the 1920s and 30s, certain films have tried to capitalize on people's sort of interest in things that aren't quite appropriate viewing. But it really wasn't until the 1950s and really into the 1960s and 70s that exploitation films took off. Part of this is because during the golden age of Hollywood, there were a lot of rules about what really could and couldn't be shown at the theaters. But once the theaters became independent and the Production Code Administration lost control over the things that you could and couldn't show on screen, things began to change, and more of the sort of cheap, attractive, lurid subject matter began to blend its way into films that were being made. Oftentimes, at least during the 50s and 60s, these films didn't tend to show by themselves. They were part of double features or were attached in some way to other movies because they were not, the main thing that you would have gone to see a film for, but would have been something you would have staged after paying your ticket to watch afterwards. That was some sort of cheaply made film that could quickly turn a budget for the company. Exploitation films aren't really a genre. It's more of like a category of film. Within exploitation films, there's lots of other sort of subgenres that people talk about. Sexploitation films. Sexploitation films are those ones that really focus on cheap, graphic, nudity, and cheap sex scenes to try to keep viewers' attention. Sex is cheap to film. Often people will pay to see it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to violence, the word and the act. While violence cloaks itself in a plethora of disguises, its favorite mantle still remains sex. Violence devours all it touches, its voracious appetite rarely fulfilled. Yet violence doesn't only destroy, it creates and molds as well. Let's examine closely then this dangerously evil creation, this new breed, encased and contained within the supple skin of woman.
There's a whole subgenre of rape and revenge films that we've seen come out over the decades. Cannibal films are a subgenre of exploitation films that focus on, cannibals and their interactions with people who aren't cannibals, often ending rather poorly. Carsploitation films is a whole subgenre that tries to attract viewers' attention through kind of ridiculous car-related stunts and feats, often very violent. Blaxploitation films is a whole cycle in the 1970s trying to attract viewers' attention through sort of like capitalizing on the sort of in vogue sort of black subculture of the US. And the genres kind of just keep going. You even get into sort of like weird subgenres, or at least the names are weird, and sometimes the subgenres are weird, like Exploitation, which was a phrase coined to talk about exploitation films coming out of Canada that include even some directors that are much more well-known, like David Cronenberg's films. And the names of these exploitation films are often really revealing. You have things like Motorpsycho, Last Cannibal World, Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, How to Stuff a Wild Bikini. The names themselves already open up in your mind the kinds of things that these films are about. They're about often very violent or very sexualized things that are there to be cheap, attention-grabbing stuff on screen. Let me give you a little example of a 1980s exploitation film. This one is called Forbidden World. It's from 1982. And it's a really good example because it tries to exploit several different angles on filmmaking. One is that it draws heavily from a very popular film or set of films from the 1980s, namely the Alien franchise. Forbidden World follows a guy who goes to a planet and he's received a call that he needs to go help because some thing, in this case an experiment, has kind of gone awry, and it turns out that this sort of like alien experimental creature is terrorizing this isolated facility. But it also exploits a lot of really cheap moments of sex and nudity and violence. There are moments of nudity and sex that are completely irrelevant to the plot, which is typical of many exploitation films. Some of the shots are designed just to especially exploit women's bodies in a way that is very typical of exploitation films. And there's some moments of really extreme graphic scenes of violence. There is a scene, spoilers, where a guy has to surgically remove another man's liver, and we get to see it in extreme graphic detail, and it's got a very short runtime. The mix of these things, done on a really cheap shoestring budget, makes this an exploitation film, one of the more high-profile ones of at least the early 1980s. But if you go through the history of exploitation films, you notice that a lot of those elements are very common. Even just looking at the posters of things like Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, Death Race 2000, or things that even have been remade like I Spit on Your Grave and things like that. The posters are really trying to attract your attention through their attention to lurid subject matter. I mean, even the poster for I Spit on Your Grave says this woman has just cut, chopped, broken, and burned 5 men beyond recognition, but no jury in America would ever convict her. It's already drawing attention to the graphic violence, the poster to sort of like the scantily clad woman. And as you can probably tell from even my discussion of this right now, these films tend to be fairly misogynistic. Death Race 2000 is one of those that is definitely also worth sort of mentioning. It exploits the sort of car angle of things, like a lot of exploitation films did, car exploitation films. It has strange mise en scène with the costumes, the cheaply made, ridiculous, futuristic cars, the focus on a murderous race that gets to exploit the violence that you're allowed to do in the 1970s, and really makes for one of the crowning examples of a car exploitation film that capitalizes on cheap, violent, car-related subject matter. We'll get back to that in a moment. But no quick synopsis of exploitation films would really be complete without a mention of Roger Corman. Roger Corman is now 93 years old. I believe he was born in 1926. And he has possibly had more influence on US filmmaking since 1950 than anyone else. If you want to argue with that, I'm happy to have that debate at some point. He really is sort of like the godfather of exploitation films. He's been making stuff since the 1950s. While he has directed at times and different things, he's done a lot of producing and has been involved with over 150 films at this point in the course of his career. And while he definitely is rooted in exploitation films, and some of his films were reportedly made in 3 days, he has also actually gathered quite a lot of critical acclaim over the years. Some of his films in particular, some of his adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories, have received quite a lot of critical acclaim. But his films that he's produced and directed do often exemplify a lot of the elements we see in exploitation films. They are cheaply made, often very quickly, highlight a lot of cheap sex, nudity, graphic violence, often recycle elements of films, either past footage from films or other sets from like other films to be able to keep the budget down low. But over the years, he has worked with a huge variety of people who have become influential in their own right because Roger Corman gave them a chance to kind of step into the industry. Robert Towne, who wrote Chinatown, Nicholas Roeg, Boris Karloff, who was already famous when he worked with Roger Corman, Jack Nicholson, some of his early films with Roger Corman, Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, Jonathan Demme, Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese. All of these people have had touches with Roger Corman. Many of them really got a push along their career because of Roger Corman's ability to sort of mentor young directors and writers and workers to be able to operate quickly, cheaply, and effectively through the film medium. While exploitation film seems kind of like often a thing of the past, we see a lot of echoes of it now. We have seen sort of the reemergence of certain exploitation subgenres. The car exploitation film really kind of seems to be still popular, even though ramped up in budget. Back in the 1970s and 80s, you had the series of Mad Max films that was rebooted not just a few years ago. But you also see sort of the car exploitation style of things in things like the Fast and the Furious franchise. Mad Max is an interesting one to think about because it does tie in certain other car exploitation things that are common in car exploitation films. The sort of post-apocalyptic landscape. It's violent, kind of strange. You have characters who are very deformed and graphic things happen to them. But you also have other sort of films coming out recently that try to be exploitative in different ways, or at least elevate the exploitation genre. Mandy is an interesting one, one that kind of continues the trend of using exploitation styles in sort of more artistically focused, critically acclaimed kind of ways. I hope this gives you a quick little look at exploitation films, what they are, and at least a little bit of the history and influence of exploitation films. I encourage you to explore more if you would like to. Just keep in mind, well, they're not the kind of films that you often go around bragging about being your #1 film. Anyways, I'm Kyle Mark Walter for Film Bite. Thank you for joining me for Film Bite Dishes, and we'll see you again next time.